everyone, and welcome to tonight's talk on a very topical issue. We are very pleased to have Clare Rewcastle-Brown with us tonight, who will be talking about one of the largest corruption scandals in Malaysia. Now, we are competing with an event on Southeast Asia down at LSE, so I'm very glad to see so many people actually have turned up. That's great, and also, of course, shows the interest in this topic. Now, let me just introduce the speaker quickly, and then we'll talk about the issue. Clare Rewcastle-Brown was born in Sarawak and has worked for many years as an investigative journalist who founded the Sarawak Report and then also Radio Free Sarawak in 2010. She has used these two outlets to disseminate her research, analysis and reportage on corruption and collusion and other political issues surrounding the destruction of Sarawak's rainforest, for instance, and how that has impacted the livelihoods of people in Sarawak. And then in 2015, basically was here in London and then reported on that corruption scandal that we are going to talk about today. Rewcastle-Brown was honored as a Fortune magazine 50 World's Greatest Leader in 2016, and the impact of Radio Free Sarawak was also highlighted when it won the International Press Institute's Free Media Pioneers Award in 2013, and then the Communications for Social Change Award in 2014. So we'll have an introduction and a talk for about 45 minutes, and then we'll have a Q&A. We have the room until 9 o'clock, so there's enough time for your questions and discussion. So please help me welcome Clare Rewcastle-Brown.
Thank you, all of you, so much for coming. Some of you a very long way, I've learnt today, so I'm really thrilled that you've been able to do that. And thank you also, Monsoon Book Club, Piao, and you also, Michael, for hosting the event. When we first mooted doing something about this, it was almost a year ago, I think, so we thought we might sort of try and get a gathering and have me explain 1MDB. I thought, gosh, people are going to wonder what this is all about. Of course, now we've got to this stage, and I'm worrying really that there's not going to be anything I'm going to be able to tell you didn't know already. So forgive me, I think I'll probably just avoid the number crunching. I know I've got a lot of people who know about Southeast Asian issues here, and you're all very informed and academic types. So I thought I would try and perhaps stick more to my role in the whole story, which has been as a reporter, and in a way make a plea for the role of reporting in these sorts of situations, because well, frankly, 1MDB had almost come and gone away. It was almost done and dusted before anyone knew about it, and when I started opening up the story. So there I am. There's me as a reporter, up a tree. Not just any old tree, that was a tree in Beverly Hills, Hollywood. And I was taking photographs of Riza Aziz's secret Hollywood mansion. I'd had fun that day. I'd posed as a parcel delivery lady, of which there are many well-spoken British parcel delivery ladies in Hollywood, I was told before I dared. And they absolutely corroborated that was Riza's address when I asked where I should deliver the parcel. So why was I doing this? What had got me stuck into this? That's the house, by the way. In fact, that was being ripped down. It had cost several million, and he was ripping it down and rebuilding it. And in the end, actually, I went inside and took photographs all around the house. And when I inevitably received the legal letters, which I did, I received two sets of complaints. One which was that I'd accused Riza Aziz, or the client, of owning a property he didn't. And the other was that I had invaded the privacy of his client by trespassing on his property. I had been alerted to this story in the Christmas New Year of 2013-14, which was when this very expensive haram movie was launched. And someone had mentioned to me that the Prime Minister's wife of Malaysia had been shocking education officials by suggesting that school children in Malaysia should all be encouraged to watch this film as a warning against immoral lifestyles. And of course, very, very worried and concerned education officials. Well, it didn't take much Googling to work out that the reason for her enthusiasm was that her son was the producer of the movie. And it didn't take much more Googling before I noted that that he was being pretty much touted around Hollywood as he put it, having his skin in the movie. Reza is the second on the left, next to the chubby Chinese Malaysian who you can see on the extreme left. Who is, of course, Joe Low, the fantastically wealthy, flamboyant financier. And what had struck me as I looked at all this promotional material was that Joe Low was in all the pictures. He was in all the launches, And when in early January, Leo DiCaprio went up to take his Golden Globe Award, he thanked Joey and Reza for taking a risk on the movie. So I was starting to have questions in my mind. I'd done a bit of research on Reza, perfectly nice young man, very young man, not had much of a career behind him, a couple of years at HSBC Bank in a junior position. How was it that he was suddenly producing a $100 million movie in Hollywood? And how come that this particular guy, who everyone in Malaysia had by then heard quite a lot about, Joe Low with his favourite party friend there, Paris Hilton, how was it that he was always involved? And as I dug deeper, it was plain that he was the man who was regarded as being the money behind the movie. Now, as people in Malaysia all pretty much knew by then, Joe Low was regarded as a key ally of this couple, particularly friendly with Rosma, who I've subsequently discovered actually he met her at some sailing event, and he's a very personable, quick-speaking young man and very good at making connections, And Rosma rules the roost. That's certainly the view that most people have in Malaysia. Jolo was soon in there. And everyone knew that he'd been involved, and he'd had to admit he'd been involved because he was on the early websites of the Terengganu Investment Authority, which was to morph into 1MDB pretty much within weeks of Najib Razak coming into power in April 2009. He was very well known as being involved, although he'd started denying it. So I'd started asking questions, really. How come? And how come also that Reza appeared to have so much personal wealth, not only with what turned out to be 2 secret Hollywood mansions, but one of the most expensive penthouses in New York as well. And that's a job of a journalist, when you have those many things falling into place. How come he's there? How come he has so much money? And where does Joe Low fit in, I asked? Has this connection got anything to do with the fact that Joe Low is known as a key business advisor to the 1MDB development fund that was run by Reza's stepdad, Najib Razak? And I got a very, very aggressive response to that. I wasn't supposed to ask those questions. I've said I got, a great deal of aggressive response. I had several legal letters, and that made me more interested. So I kept on with the story. I had got involved in the first place. I feel about this, now that 1MDB has evolved, and we're talking about the biggest banks in the world being in trouble, and global financial systems being ruptured, and all the rest. I think about how this was a bottom-up story for me, And again, as a journalist, why did I get involved? It was because I could see that something was going really wrong for ordinary people who didn't have a voice. And they were the people from the place where I grew up, which was Sarawak, which until recently had one of the most precious jungle environments of immense beauty and scientific value that we should have taken care of. And it was ripped out. And there was no logical reason for the way that the Borneo jungle has been destroyed. No commercial good reason, no social good reason. There was only one possible motive, which was the rapid and explosive enrichment of a very small number of people. And of course, Abdul Taib Mahmood was at the centre of that. I had started, I suppose, advocating the cause of people that I went up to visit upriver in the jungle, who were finding that they couldn't live anymore off the resources that they had once been able to live off, and they were getting none of the financial benefits whatsoever from the destruction of the rainforest. And nobody else was covering it. So I got stuck into that and had been pretty quickly, I got stuck into the corruption issue, because that was the driving force behind what was going on. And it was quite easy to, once I started looking into it, to expose Taib Mahmood's enormous wealth, the way he had been corruptly handing out vast public lands, often what should have been were by law native lands, to members of his family, to cronies, making billions and billions of dollars. And it was quite easy also. I started exposing the foreign properties, enormous billion-dollar foreign property portfolios that this particular man and his family had abroad. And we've made quite a lot of progress against Taib. In some ways, my project and the radio project that went with it, we felt we were quite cutting edge. And social media had just arrived in Borneo and Malaysia, and had taken off like wildfire. And a lot of it was in English. And I just started by saying, I think I can take part in this debate. There was a lot going on. There were many, many local people who shared my concerns. None of this could seep into the mainstream media, which is extremely heavily and tightly controlled, as anyone who knows anything about Malaysia is well aware. But the social media was free, and what I thought I'd do, as somebody who'd spent many years as a journalist, I would try to produce a more sort of disciplined, professional, approach to the way that I covered issues that other people were talking a lot about, but weren't perhaps necessarily taking the trouble to corroborate stuff, nail stuff, get the story banged to rights. And I was having a ball, actually. I moved on from Taib. We got a dossier. We got a Malaysian Anti-Corruption Commission report down on the desk of the Attorney General against Taib. In fact, he was kicked upstairs to be the governor, as most of you will know. And I think we played a part in that. Moved next door to Sabah and Musa Aman, and did a pretty comprehensive job on Musa Aman. Got all his bank records for his offshore companies, and showed how he'd siphoned through various front people, one of them currently in jail in Malaysia actually, into 100 million into his Zurich bank accounts. And thankfully, actually very recently, after trying to stop the prosecution for years, UBS is now facing court action within Switzerland on the subject of Musa Aman's bank accounts. What I was finding, no surprise perhaps, was that these two Borneo states, who have numerous seats that they control, and in fact who have been keeping the federal ruling coalition of BN in power for very many years now, they were not going to be proceeded against by the federal government under Najib Razak. And those dossiers, diligently drawn up by the anti-corruption officials against both those state leaders, were mouldering on the desk of the Attorney General, much to my annoyance. I come from I come from a culture where if you get a jolly good scandal on a political figure, you expect them to sort of resign or something, you know. I had so much learning to do. Anyway, so one's eyes tend to sort of wander on up. I started, you know, as I say, I started with the problem and started looking at the causes. And 1MDB had caught my eye. Everybody was talking about it as Najib's slush fund for the election, the 2013 election, not least because huge sums of money had been borrowed, supposedly for the development. There was total lack of transparency about where that money had gone. Nothing that had been promised would happen. For example, this business, Tun Razak Exchange development, nothing was being built. And yet, as we arrived at that 2014 period, the fund was billions of dollars in debt. And by the end of 2014, it had reached crunch time because it couldn't meet the debt repayments. So something was really very wrong. And so I just kept on, you know, I'd already got my hit, and I kept on sniffing away at 1MDB. Now, I'm jumping. The picture's jumping me ahead, but so I'll jump with it, which is to say that what I had discovered was that the first big mega deal that this development fund had got itself involved in was with this company PetroSaudi. It sounds as if it ought to be, you know, having petrol stations all over London, doesn't it? It's got a great name. But actually, who'd heard of it? Who were these people? We did a little bit of digging and found out that it was a bunch of sort of jet set guys, but who hadn't really done anything very much. There's Tariq. Actually, that's him on a yacht causing scandal in Turkey over the summer. Those girls later removed their clothing for the paparazzi. And that's this is Tariq's best friend, Patrick Marnie, who's the brains behind PetroSaudi, having fun with his friend, Lindsay Lohan. I don't know if you'd recognise her without me telling you who that was. So who were these guys? I also had a Sarawak angle to this because the only other thing PetroSaudi had ever done, apart from going to a joint venture with 1MDB that then didn't seem to do anything, was actually buy out one of Taib Mahmood in Sarawak's big company, UBG, you know, at a really good price. They you know, Taib been trying to get rid of UBG for ages and then sold it off to PetroSaudi. And actually just after Joe Low had bought a big chunk of the company. You know, so everybody was wondering about that and whispering maybe some money had come from that 1MDB deal to keep that very powerful state minister whose votes were so incredibly pivotal to the success of BN at the 2013 election. You know, people talk like that in Malaysia. And of course it was entirely true, and we were going to prove that that's exactly what happened. There was one other big player that got involved with 1MDB. You know, this is a very, very complex money laundering exercise. Anyone who's read about it, you know, I mean, the Singaporeans, you know, have said it's the most complicated money laundering investigation they've ever had to do. It's the biggest money laundering investigation, according to the Americans, that they've ever had to deal with. And, you know, once those charts go up and, you know, you're seeing money, you know, it's hard. But actually, the overall scheme, which is what I'm going to stick to, was simple. Huge sums of money, big tranches siphoned out, and two main deals. The second one was with the Adalah Fund, which was a subsidiary of 1MDB, subsidiary of IPIC, which is a sovereign wealth fund in Abu Dhabi, and that was after PetroSaudi. They moved on to Adalah, and of course this I knew as well when I was handing around Hollywood. And the gentleman on the right, shaking the hands of the sheikhs, he's the chief executive officer of Adalah. And as I was trying to get new stories, you know, on 1MDB, you know, I even managed to justify a trip, as you gathered to Hollywood. Something really interesting, there'd been a lot of lashback about my questions about Reese's source of funding for Wolf of Wall Street. And eventually, lo and behold, this guy from a bar comes out and says, Jolo had nothing to do with this. I paid for the movie. And it was jaw-dropping because, this guy's a chief executive. He's a good salary job and he works for a sovereign wealth fund. And not only that, the conflict of interest was every bit as, questionable as that of Joy Low, because he was the other major partner of 1MDB. So, I kind of said, how come that's something that should shut me up? I then dug on a little bit further and found some very useful court records, which showed that Joe Low had been lying. And again, this is just, this is where a journalist comes in. We're just, we niggle away. We can't do the big stuff, but we showed he'd been lying because 1MDB, according to a court case that was filed here in London, had financed an attempt by Joe Low to buy out the biggest hotel group in London, including Claridge's Hotel here. And it was all there in black and white. Now, Joe Low had been going around saying, as I remind you, that he'd had nothing to do with 1MDB or any of these guys, since May of 2009. This bid was in 2011. So then I kind of got my real haul of information, and of course that's Paul Xavier Justo, who I'd heard about as I'd been digging and digging and digging. Anyone had any information on 1MDB, and I heard that there was someone who'd mentioned to someone that he did. And it took me about 6 months to persuade Xavier. I'm dreading having to meet him when he gets out of jail. But we understand, and he understands. Xavier had a massive data on that PetroSaudi deal. He had been a director of PetroSaudi. He had joined the company shortly after they'd landed this enormous deal with 1MDB. And he was able to tell me everything that happened, and he gave me a dossier. He was trying to sell it, and that was used very much against us. In the end, he gave it. He didn't receive any money. I introduced him to the head of the Edge newspaper group in Singapore. It's been a much documented story. He was forced into a dreadful confession when he was in jail in Thailand over a year ago. Told that if he said whatever they wanted him to say, he'd get out. Well, he's still in there, of course. This was him being arrested. It was, as you can see, very much a staged arrest. You've got the cameraman there from the New Straits Times, who was there waiting and ready. It was very much orchestrated by his former colleagues at PetroSaudi and by the Malaysians. The information that I extracted from those files was devastating. The first $1 billion invested by 1MDB had been put into a joint venture with this PetroSaudi nobody outfit. And then nobody'd known nothing happened, and everyone wondered. And what I was to be able to prove from the data and from photographs like this that were actually in the data as well, it was the server for the company, was exactly how they plotted it. And you've got the lineup here for the first bunch of plotters. Joe Low again. Next to him, Prince Turki Abdullah Al Saud. And he was the seventh son of the then king of Saudi Arabia, and he was the key man in all this. Standing on the right-hand side of Najib. In fact, he did nothing, but he had a 50% share in the company. And this enabled this scheme that they had, which was to present 1MDB as something so high up, so sovereign wealthy, state to statey, government to government, diplomatic immunity style enterprise that no one could question it. Relations with Saudi Arabia were at stake. And looking through all the presentation to all the bankers and bureaucrats that had to be sort of mollified really by this very unusual deal. It was always said, this is the king of Saudi Arabia's company. You can't question this. We have to drive it through. This is about, investment by Saudi Arabia into Malaysia. Now, well, there's, going on in ascending importance, Rosma, the very, very forceful wife of the Prime Minister. Next to her, one of her sons, and then Tariq Abeid. And then on the far end, Rosma's daughter, who had the most expensive series of weddings a few months later that Malaysia, probably Southeast Asia, has ever witnessed. And no one could work out how those weddings were paid for because, the Najibs were not rich. Najib Razak was not rich. So what I was later to be able to show is that actually they're on a yacht there that they hired and pretended, the Petro-Saudi boys hired it and pretended it belonged to Prince Turkey, the Tatoosh. It didn't, They were all conning each other, really. I mean, there was no money in Petro-Saudi whatsoever. They were just a bunch of adventurers trying to flog this contact they had. And it's just absolutely wonderful. Rosma thought it was fantastic. She believed it all. She thought, that he was a fantastically rich prince. But what they agreed was that they were going to do this deal. They were going to do this joint venture. And the emails from the service show me that the following week, Tariq, who had no business brain at all, contacted his pal Patrick, introduced him by email to Joe Lowe. Patrick then, flies first class to New York to meet Joe Lowe, where he was working out of. They had, they booked a restaurant, the most expensive restaurant in the world. I forget the name of it actually, Kobe. And sat down to lunch, and then 2 days later, Patrick writes a very useful, informative email to Joe Lowe, saying how, further to their discussions, he's very happy to act as a front for the plans that they had put together. One of the hallmarks of all the 1MDB deals is that fantastically expensive investments are made in lightning speed. So within 2 weeks, the $1 billion investment in the joint venture deal had been processed, 2.5. The second half of September. The Prime Minister, for reasons best known to him, maybe I'll find out why the 29th of September had to be the day, but he'd said, the big boss they all called him, he said that he wanted this deal signed by the 29th of September, and it was. The companies involved hadn't even been incorporated when Patrick Marnie flew back from New York. In fact, he had to get 15 lawyers in from White and Case who sort of camped in their cramped offices. They didn't have fancy offices in those days. They were hiring something at the back end of Victoria, actually. They now occupy number 1 Curzon Street. It was an overnight transformation, which was their downfall, actually. So this deal was pushed through, and the way they did it was to have a construct where Petro-Saudi created a joint venture company and then imposed lent it some money, some fictitious money. They lent it fictitiously $700 million. And 1MDB's management agreed that, when they bought into the joint venture, they would pay back that loan. And who would enter such an agreement? I mean, it was laughable. The only reason why the management were willing to do all this, and actually the management of 1MDB were only told about the deal on the 15th of the month. The deal was signed on the 29th. So this was driven through with lightning speed. There was an excuse, which was a lie. The excuse was that Petro-Saudi had an oil field in the Caspian Sea, and that they were injecting this oil field into the joint venture, and so therefore, the 700 million was justified. They were bringing all this amazing amount of money in, and indeed, Edward Morse, an American banker, who used to be a Republican energy Under-Secretary of State, actually. He was an out-of-work banker at that time. He's now the head of commodities at Citibank. He kindly, based on information provided by Patrick Marnie, provided a valuation of the company, which he took one day to provide, saying that it was worth $2.9 billion. The company didn't actually belong to Petrosaudi. They'd paid some money to the actual company that owned it to sort of borrow the ownership for a couple of weeks. And one of the first things they had to do after the deal was signed was quickly, get out of that deal. Otherwise, they'd have had to have bought the company. There was no oil anyway. It was in a disputed region of the Caspian Sea, and they've never been able to get at the oil. So it was 100% total fraud, scam. And the board of 1MDB was... as we later found out, just steamrolled. They'd absolutely prohibited all of this, but it happened. So I got all this information, and it was a great story. We did the whole thing and looked at how the money had been used to buy out UBG as well. I was able to show that 700 million at the last minute. It was supposed to go to Petrosaudi and one of its subsidiaries to pay back the fictitious loan, but actually it went into a company called Goodstar. And Goodstar, I didn't have the documentation at that stage, but I did have a contract from somebody who purported to be the investment manager of Goodstar, who was hiring Patrick Marnie and Tariq Abeid and giving them a brokerage fee of $85 million for having helped by acting as a front in this deal. That was signed by Seatley Lin, who was Joe Low's known sidekick. In fact, the contract had Seat's mobile phone number on it, and I couldn't resist, so I just thought I'd try. I rang the mobile phone number, didn't answer. 2 minutes later, my phone rang back, and it was him. I said, "Oh, hello." He said, "Who's calling me?" I said, "Is that Seatley Lin?" Yes, what do you want? I said, I'm from Sarawak Report, and I want to know if you were involved, if you're the investment manager for Goodstar. And that phone never went on again. Those are the moments we enjoy. The money got, people actually, I think Najib wasn't expecting, he inherited this incredibly powerful position. And, I think impunity has been what this has all been about. They really thought that they could bulldoze their way through it, and to give them their due, they jolly well nearly did. I mean, nobody was covering this. None of the mainstream media, nobody was covering this. But there was a lot of criticism within the political establishment, and a lot of people were actually fair to say, a lot of people were criticising the fact that nothing had come out of this Petrosaudi deal. And in the end, what they decided to do, they went through various sort of, I can't go into the detail of it now, we can talk later, but they altered their relations and their relationship with Petrosaudi over about 2 years, largely in order to baffle the auditors and leave things out of the accounts, to be honest. But in the end, they decided that they were going to close down the deal. It was the best way they would get out of it completely. And they alleged that they had that they actually been bought out of their joint venture deal for $2.3 billion. 1.83 billion went into the deal. Most of that actually was siphoned into Goodstar. And so they said, great, Najib's a hero. He's made a fantastic profit out of this investment. We're not actually going to bring it back to Malaysia. We've invested it in a Cayman Island fund. It's very reputable. We're not going to give you the name of the fund. And no more questions, please. Being in Malaysia, that's where we stood in 2014. Well, I better race on a bit. Reaction to me having done that story was, I became famous in Malaysia. What can I say? Not because of me, but because of the way these people reacted. They pretty much decided if they could demonize me and demonize Sarawak Report, and make out we were a bunch of liars, they could squash this story. And of course they had got the mainstream media churning this out, and it was quite touch and go, actually. I was very worried, that I wasn't going to be able to make this story go anywhere. Petrosaudi was pouring money into threatening all the mainstream international financial press who were interested. And they were holding back. They didn't want to spend all that money, fighting a really big company with lots of big lawyers. I was fine, I just said, come and sue me, I've got nothing. And funnily enough, they didn't, because they knew I knew, and they couldn't go to court. But the big papers were staying carefully away from the story. It got very good coverage on the online media from Malaysia Kini, the much lamented Malaysian insider, and that way the story kept bubbling in the in Malaysia. And meanwhile, I had taken over. I was being criticised a lot for not actually giving the material to the correct authorities and purely, mentioning this on my blog. I had given all this material to the correct authorities on day one. And I was waiting to see if the regulators that I had gone to were going to act, and I was worried they wouldn't. It got very nasty. The red shirts got going, and I think any of you who've been in Malaysia watching the Malaysian news, we can talk about all of that. Actually, someone sent me a whole lot of TV coverage of the time, which I'm glad I didn't see at the time. There are some quite amazing things that were put out. I just got on with the story, actually. And I, quite early on, that's another thing about being a journalist, actually. If you do an investigative thing and you bring out information, often people will then contact you and say, actually, I've got something on this. It might be useful, might be interesting. And I go, ooh. Somebody got in touch with me and they said, I've got a lot of information on this second deal. I don't know if that's interesting to you, but I've got all the bank account details of Kader Markabesi. So Kader Markabesi is the guy in the robe, second one on. He's the CEO, the real head guy at Abar was Kader Markabesi. He was the big hitter and had a lot of clout. He was a very, very powerful sovereign wealth manager in Abu Dhabi at that time, massive reputation. And in fact, the guy next to him is the Crown Prince, who was dragged over for this second ceremony. Exactly the same scheme as the Good Star one. The same thing, state to state, investment by an Arab-friendly country, Muslim, affirmation in Malaysia, we're such good fellows in every way, and then, you have, great publicity and all that, and then, sort of money just disappears and nothing happens. This is exactly the same. There were two main stages of this relationship with Abar. One was the power purchase loans that were raised under the aegis of a joint venture. Well, there was a joint guarantee in this case from Abar in 2012, two $1.75 billion loans, supposedly to buy power plants that was going to, produce some kind of revenue for the company. Half the money went immediately away. And then later in 2013, this particular, you said the 12th of March, was the day of this particular strategic partnership between Malaysia and Abu Dhabi, which was launched on the 12th of March. By the 19th of March, under the guise of that strategic partnership, which in fact Abu Dhabi never did anything, Najib had got Goldman Sachs to raise another $3 billion. That had been raised by the 19th of March, and by the 21st of March, 681 million had arrived in Najib's personal bank account in KL. And, I was asking questions quite early on about the strange coincidence of those facts. And of course, that's exactly what happened. And he'd got that money into his account in order to fight the election, which he called very soon after. Now, the person who contacted me had alerted me to the fact that there were two sides to Kadam. There was the guy in the robe, and there was Kadam, the somewhat, very lewd nightclub guy, who was obsessed with a very different lifestyle. And Kadam had been spending money. That's his Hollywood mansion, one of the most expensive, I gather. And he'd been investing hugely in the lifestyle that he secretly loved, which was nightclubs. And within 18 months, Kadam had somehow found the money again as he's a salaried guy, works for a sovereign wealth fund, probably quite good bonuses. But Hakkasan went from zero to being the biggest nightclub and restaurant state in the United States in 18 months. And they had to have a yacht as well, didn't he? That's the Topaz, which he was funding actually for Prince Mansour. So out of that, I had to be careful to begin with, because the bank accounts and details I got on Kadam had showed me that over $500 million had gone into his Edmund de Rothschild bank account in Luxembourg during the period of 2012, early 2013, as my informant had reminded me. That was just after those power purchase deals. Most of that money had come from an outfit called Blackstone Asia Real Estate Partners Limited. I thought, my goodness, I knew the banks were involved. Is Blackstone involved in this? I didn't know what to think. Well, I didn't know the scheme at that time. But there was also very conveniently a 20 million payment from Goodstar. Ooh, a 20 million payment from Goodstar, which was the Petro-Saudi company, into to this Kadam guy, who's in a completely different relationship with 1MDB, a couple of years later. So I asked the question, and they got sacked from their Abu Dhabi jobs pretty much immediately. I'd been getting very little, response in Malaysia. They were just denying everything, but actually Abu Dhabi acted immediately, if only because they were so infuriated by the various pictures I had of Kadam living it up in the nightclubs, I suspect. But Kadam is now in jail. I found out who owned Blackstone. It wasn't, of course, anything to do with the well-known company. It was to do with it was a Jolo company. It was another company like Goodstar, owned by Jolo, and that was one of his techniques. He had a spread of offshore companies, they all had wonderfully, deceptive names. So they were called Blackstone or Merrill, or so that there was an understanding that they were something they weren't. And, it's a great idea until somebody rumbles it, and then you're so exposed, aren't you? Now, what happened in the early days of those exposés that I'd done was that you started getting investigations in Malaysia. And everybody went, and there was a real shock factor, and the Prime Minister just said, "Oh, this has nothing to do with me. I have a very distanced, relationship with the fund, and of course I will allow investigations so that if any wrongdoing has happened, the people involved will be severely punished," he said. So there was a period of a few weeks where investigations took place. It was known as the Joint Task Force, MACC, Central Bank, the police, and the Attorney General. The Auditor General was set about the task of making his now officially secret report, and indeed the Public Accounts Committee started questioning people. And out of all those investigations, more information started to leak into my inbox. And one of the key steps forward again was the information I got, which was from that 700 million that had been paid into Jolo's account in Coutts, Switzerland. It was starting to be transferred to BSI Bank in Singapore. From then on, really, it was a kind of cat and mouse game that went on. They hadn't been able to sue me, but they were trying to discredit me. And, we had great fun. The Leicester story, he was somebody who'd done a stint on Sarawak Report, and he accused me of being a forger and came up with all sorts of outlandish and wonderful stories, all of which were quite easy to debunk, really. But he was given an enormous amount of airtime in Malaysia, and, and this cat and mouse game went on for months. It's a year and a half now of bit by bit finding more and more little bits of the jigsaw out. And the problem for Najib was all those bits of the jigsaw just corroborated what had been said. There was nothing that didn't corroborate the story. So eventually from those investigations, I got a pretty valuable piece of information, just as, you know, I was being hounded, actually. Justo had been jailed. We were headline news, and I was able to come back with the story that $681 million had been paid into Najib Razak's bank accounts in KL, and that had been discovered by the 1MDB investigation. And most of you will know that I gave that story to the Wall Street Journal as well, which was really a very big trigger also in all this, because it meant that a major international paper was now on the story and chasing it. After several weeks, Najib came up with his explanation for the donation, he called it. We had enormous fun in this cat and mouse game, sort of trying to find the fake sheikh who had supposedly given him this money because he so admired Najib. 681 million is a lot of money to give away. You have to be really rich, and there was no one by the name of Abdul Aziz Al Saud. It was quite a complicated name, and he changed it a few times too, but who had that sort of money. There was a final, tranche to the money disappearance issue. We've talked about Good Star. We've talked about the Tuabar, heists. There was the last bit of money that went into 1MDB, which had come from the public pension fund, the civil service fund called QOP. And $4 billion had been borrowed by a company that was set up as a subsidiary of 1MDB called SRC. And people had been asking where that had gone, and no one got a reasonable answer. There was, they kept coming up with explanations, and we kept being able to say, well, yeah, but that didn't cost very much. What was lethal about the SRC material was that actually that had been within Malaysia. So the local authorities were able to follow that through, and they had shown that money had gone from SRC directly into some other Najib accounts. And they had shown that that this money had been spent on frivolous things. And that was one I found out about. And all this stuff was coming out. So actually, although he only stole 70 million ringgit, that's, I suppose, about, 20 million pounds, from SRC, through that route, it was something they could really nail. And we're talking about the end of July, and the 4 task force heads, I was getting all this back channel. Something's going to happen, Claire. You're not going to believe it. They're going to arrest Najib. I was saying, if I've heard it, he's heard it. And sure enough, he had. But, they issued an arrest warrant for Najib. They had it all written up and they were ready. Just to let you know, I did find out quite recently, internationally, he stole, much bigger sums from SRC, and of course there's still a whole lot missing. The Swiss know about this. They've got all the details. But it was on that smaller amount of money that they issued the arrest warrant. And of course Najib did find out about it, and he reacted very, very aggressively. He used special branch to arrest the Attorney General himself, which was unconstitutional, on his way to work on the 28th of July. And he sacked his deputy prime minister. He sacked the Attorney General, although the man was forced to say he was sick. He sacked the Vice President Apandi. He changed the people who were asking too many difficult questions. He changed the chairman of the Public Accounts Committee. It was an internal coup d'etat against his own government. I was slipped this the following day again through my inbox. It was the arrest warrant. So again, he reckoned he'd swatted it. He'd silenced everybody. He'd got a new Attorney General in who very rapidly declared him not guilty. But I got this story out about the arrest warrant. He had his revenge. That was the guy who released me the information. He was disappeared and found encased in a cement drum a few weeks later. And that was just one aspect of the crackdown that Najib has been shocking. I'm sure you know, people, human rights organisations across the world, you know what's been going on in Malaysia. Endless arbitrary arrests, bullying, harassment of civil rights opposition figures. Rafizi Ramli, sentenced just day before yesterday. I, meanwhile, became the first website to be officially banned in Malaysia. I was accused of spreading false information. It was on those grounds that I was closed down. And of course a warrant was issued for my arrest for activities detrimental to parliamentary democracy. And Interpol was alerted and requested to catch me and take me back to Malaysia, which thankfully was rejected. Now that gets us really to the beginning of the unbuttoning. I guess as everything was looking really bad, on the 20th of August 2015, the first signal came out from the regulatory authorities, and actually it wasn't America, it was Switzerland who made the first announcement that they were investigating 1MDB. And over the following months, we've seen, little announcements coming out that have basically bolstered my and other people who've been covering 1MDB's position on this. And I could go through that side of things in more detail, although I am aware that I promised I would only talk for 45 minutes. So I think I will probably leave it there because, that was really, the first stage of this. From then on, it's been, the unravelling. Capped really by the confirmation of everything that I had been saying, everything that I had been pointing to by the DOJ on the 20th of July of this year. The DOJ came out with the most devastating 136-page indictment, just beautifully laying out exactly where all that stolen money went to, how and when. And, the list, if you've got nothing better to do, get it up and read it. I haven't even managed to get round to the outrageous stories I was going to tell you about the lifestyles of these thieves. But the DOJ do it very nicely for me, the jets they bought, the penthouses, the companies, the hotels, the artwork, the Monets and the Van Goghs and the Rothkos. Picassos that they bought, all part of their money laundering and hedonism, unbelievable hedonism of these guys. And of course, I might just end on that note. Frankly, if Joe Low hadn't responded at the end of September, when they landed all this money, Joe Low responded by his sidekick. I picked up so much of what was going on social media, because they'd go off and have these amazing parties, and then they would, have a confidentiality thing for all the people who'd attended the party. And of course, Instagram and Facebook, there was no way they weren't going to put pictures of themselves up at these amazing parties, and it would all come out. We'd just find it. The earth shook, according to that Seat Lee Lin, the day after I'd seen that the deal went through. They all went off to Las Vegas. And they've been on a party ever since. And that's what drew attention to them. Their outrageous partying, funded by money that was supposed to be for development in Malaysia, and that stupid movie. And frankly, if they hadn't drawn the attention of people like me by behaving like that, they probably wouldn't have a problem at this time. So there's lots more I could talk about, so maybe we should just turn it over to questions and conversation.
Thanks so much.
All right, so we have plenty of time for Q&A.